Today I'm going to tell you a simply amazing story that Agorgri unearthed. Today, you will look at Moscow from a slightly different angle and see just an incredible forgery. In short, the whole history of Moscow is not what you were told about. So, let's get started. We'll start, of course, with the sizes. Everyone knows that Moscow is a very big city, but few people thought about how big Moscow was in the 18th century, and which European capitals were losing out to it in size with a bang. We will start with the plan of Moscow 1597th year. The plan in historical works is recognized as reliable and is called the Petrov drawing. So, according to this plan, the area of Moscow in the 16th century was 18.5 square kilometers. Smolensk in 1817 occupied an area of less than 2 square kilometers. Hamburg in 1841 3.6 square kilometers. Amsterdam in 1844th year 8 square kilometers. Berlin in 1860 13 and 8 square kilometers. London in 1807 17.3 square kilometers. That is, a little less than Moscow. New York, 1840th year, 17.5 square kilometers. And finally, St. Petersburg 1849th year. Just a huge city, the area of which was a record 34 square kilometers. As we can see, Moscow is larger in size in this comparison by the area of any European capital. In other words, we are told at school that Peter the Great went to study crafts in Amsterdam. But, even in the 19th century, Amsterdam looked quite modest. Only 8 square kilometers. That is, Moscow of the 16th century, 18.5 square kilometers, the commercial capital of Europe. Amsterdam, only 8. And that's the size of a city in the 19th century. That is, a city located outside the trade routes, far from the sea, was larger than a city that is located on the main trade routes of Europe. Moscow of the 16th century exceeds in size any European capital of the early 19th century. Don't you think it's weird? In addition, according to the schedule of 1638th year, 200,000 people lived in the capital of Russia. And by 1776, the number of the city had decreased to 160,000 people. And this is also very remarkable. The population is declining by the 19th century, and Moscow is making a new giant leap in size. But more on that later. For comparison, the large commercial city of Amsterdam had 50,000 inhabitants in 1660, and 200,000 in 1700. That is, in a city standing on European trade routes, in 1700 years, 200,000 inhabitants lived on an area of 8 square kilometers. Let me remind you that Moscow 100 years earlier had an area twice as large. London in 1663 has 460,000 inhabitants, and it was only at the beginning of the 19th century that London caught up with Moscow in size, and by 1807th year, its area was 17 square kilometers. It's all kind of weird. Backward Russia of the 16th century. There are no artists of their own, there are no architects of their own. After all, even the Moscow Kremlin was built by the Italians, and there are no normal trade routes. And despite all this, Moscow surpasses all European capitals in terms of its size. But that's not the most interesting thing. Yes, Moscow in the 16th century occupied a huge area, and here in my assessments, I differ a little from Igor the Greek. He believed that Moscow in the 16th century was a small provincial town, which in the 19th century drew a different story. As for the other story, I agree, about a small town, no. Despite the absurdity of its location. There are no normal roads, there are no good river routes. I still think that in the 16th century, Moscow had simply huge dimensions at that time, and quite possibly, 18 square kilometers is a fairly real figure. Of course, Now it's hard to understand how it happened. Oh well, I think there will be more information in the future. And now let's return to the more interesting facts that Igor Grek stated, and which I fully support. Look here. Petersburg, in 1849th year. The area of the city is 34 square kilometers. At first glance, it's just a huge figure, because the area of London in 1807th year is only 17 square kilometers. And this is despite the fact that in 1800, the population of London is 1 million people. That is, Moscow of the 16th century, 200,000 people, and the size of London. In 1841, the population of London was 1,917,000 people, and the city increased in area to 54 square kilometers. Everything seems to be logical. 2 million people live in a city of 54 square kilometers. Well, that's what's weird. All logic is lost when we look at the plans of Moscow already of the 18th century. According to historical documents, in 1776th year, 161,000 people lived in Moscow. All of this seems very credible. Right up to the moment when we begin to look at the plans of Moscow at the end of the 18th century. These plans are simply amazing. Look here. 1739th year. Moscow is within the boundaries of the Kamerkalesky Val. The area of the city is 70 square kilometers. That is, according to historical documents, 160,000 Muscovites lived on an area of 70 square kilometers. 50 years have passed. In London, one person huddles on an area of 17 square kilometers. Don't you think that's weird? And now let's see how Moscow really looked like in 1878th year. And this will help us with a painting by the artist Polnareff called the Moscow Courtyard. If you do not get acquainted with the name of this picture in advance, you might think that we are seeing the outskirts of some provincial town. Terrible wilderness, paths, carts, vegetable gardens. But this is the area of Novi Arbat, inside the garden ring. So, in 1878th year, the center of Moscow looked, to put it mildly, like a village. Low-rise buildings, vegetable gardens. So why is it that in 1739th year, we draw a city with an area of 70 square kilometers? If we see such a picture within the garden ring, then what do we have on the outskirts? That is, according to Maturin's plan, 1739th year, Moscow occupied an area 4 times the area of London. But only 1 million people lived in London in 1800, and in Moscow, only 160,000. You can read all the details in the original article. Link under the video. And we'd better look at other interesting questions. For example, why was Moscow founded on this place? The question seems to be simple, and specially trained people, of course, will explain everything to us. In their opinion, one of the most important reasons for the rise of Moscow is considered to be a favorable geographical location. Moscow was a hub of Russian trade. Everything seems to be logical. Important trade routes passed through Moscow, and that is why, in the 16th century, it exceeded all major European capitals in area. Until the 19th century, 90% of goods were transported by sea and river transport. Since there is no sea near Moscow, it means that the goods went along the rivers. Let's see how convenient it is to deliver goods to and from Moscow. Look, if you need to get to Kiev or Smolensk from the Black Sea, then it's impossible to miss. It is only necessary to find the mouth of the Dnieper and climb it. But in order to deliver the goods to Moscow, it will be necessary to follow the Dnieper above Smolensk, find the mouth of the Vyazma River, and climb it to the city of the same name. There you can drag yourself to the Ugar River, go down it to the Oka, near Kaluga, then downstream of the Oka, to the city of Kolomna. Then climb up against the current of the Moskva River to the mouth of the inconspicuous Neglinaya River, and there in the forests and swamps, to discover the most cherished place called Moscow. As we can see, it is very inconvenient to deliver goods from the Black Sea region to Moscow. It is convenient to deliver to Kiev and Smolensk, but for some reason, Smolensk did not become the center of international trade and occupied an area of only 2 square kilometers. And Moscow, with a very inconvenient location, grew by leaps and bounds on trade. In other words, Moscow was not suitable for trading goods from the Black Sea basin. But it was one of the most important trade routes. It is easier to get from the Caspian Sea to Moscow, however, all the time against the barley. First along the Volga, then near Nizhny Novgorod, we turn left into the Oka, and near Kolumna, to the right, into the Moskva River. And there we came to ride some 150 kilometers along the river. And here is a very convenient Baltic way. From the Baltic Sea, along the Neva and Volkhov, to Veliki Novgorod. Then we go up the river place. We overcome the Borovichik thresholds by dragging. Then, the upper Volokik, dragged into the river Snu and Tvertsa. We descend to the Volga, find the mouth of the Lama River, climb up to Volokholamsk. And from there, of course, dragged into the Volosnya River, then into the Ruza River, which flows into the Moskva River. And we're almost there. From everything you have described, it is clearly visible on which very convenient trade routes Moscow was built. A more or less convenient way without wolves to Moscow was only from the Caspian Sea. This region was also very well developed in the Middle Ages, and in principle, Moscow could feed from the Caspian Way. But even this most convenient way on the outskirts of the city also turned into quite inconvenient. Look here. Photography of the early 20th century. In the Moscow River, the water is knee-deep. Therefore, all goods were delivered to Moscow by flat-bottomed barges with a draft of 70 centimeters. That's what contemporaries wrote about it. In summer, the river is so shallow that in some places it barely stands at 7 vershkov, that is, 30 centimeters. Hundreds of workers and herds of horses were waiting for barge caravans in the shallowest areas. On some rifts, it was necessary to hire up to 200 workers and 40 horses to move the barge. Sometimes the barges could not be removed safely. Then they were sold for scrapping. Sometimes the barge was overloaded up to 2 times, depending on what obstacles were encountered on the way. Then, it was necessary to scatter cargo on 5 barges, and sometimes on impassable shoals in the Mezin, when the depth reaches 25 centimeters. In general, the entire load on the cart was overloaded. On a horse-drawn 180 kilometers, in the way of the attack to the first throne, the caravan went for half a month, and in the worst case, a month. Here is such a convenient shopping hub Moscow. Even on the most convenient river route from the Caspian, barges were pulled by boatmen against the current. On the approaches to Moscow in the summer, these caravans overcame numerous shoals. And so, despite all the difficulties, specially trained people tell us that it was convenient trade routes that allowed Moscow to become a hub shopping center. And in terms of its size, Moscow overtook all the European cities of the 16th century, although they were on more convenient trade routes. Yes, and I want to clarify. For some reason, many people were surprised by this photo. Also, many are surprised by the fact that it was the boatmen who dragged huge barges. Like they are all banks adapted for the movement of people and horses, and therefore boatmen simply could not participate in the transportation of goods against the current. I don't know why it surprises everyone so much. Look here. Boatmen are not purely Russian know-how. All over Europe, barges were pulled along canals and rivers either by people or horses. There are just a huge number of such photos. In the middle of the 19th century, from 300 to 600,000 people were engaged in burlat fishing in Russia. There were 100,000 boatmen on the Volga alone. Entire settlements located in the Volga region were fed only at the expense of burlatsky artels. In the second half of the 19th century, steamboats began to win competition with boatmen. The railways finished off the burlatsky business. But, at the same time, the boatmen survived the Russian Empire. The final burlat draft was banned in the Soviet Union only in 1929 year. And here too, it is necessary to take into account the secret technologies of the burlap thrust. Boatmen could not always pull a barge, moving along a convenient shore. In some parts of the rivers, there are simply no suitable banks, and therefore, another uncomplicated device was used. A large drum was placed on the stern of the barge, on which a cable was then wound, to which the anchor clung. Then such an anchor on the boat was wound upstream of the river. After that, boatmen sailing on a barge came into action. The boatman clung to the cable that was wound up from the anchor, went from the bow of the ship to the stern, choosing a rope, winding it on the drum. After that, they went to the bow, and everything started all over again. Having completely selected the cable, the anchor with the cable was again brought upstream by boat. And the process was repeated. Horse racing barges were also used, where the rope was pulled by horses. Konogonki were cheaper to operate, but had their drawbacks. For example, if a barge ran aground, it was easier to pull it from the shallow water with the involvement of people. Therefore, often the preference was given to the boatman. So our kind occupiers took care of the local population and provided him with a dust-free job in the Burlatsky Artels. So Moscow up until the beginning of the 20th century was a very inconvenient city for river transport. The situation improved only after 1878th year, when the partnership of the Moskvoretsky Tour Shipping Company built 6 dams with locks, which ensured the passage of vessels with a draft of up to 90 centimeters from the mouth of the river to Moscow. So we have a very strange situation looming. Specially trained people tell us that in the 16th century, a huge city with an area of 18 square kilometers was built. The city lived on trade. All this, of course, is good. Only there was one convenient trade route to this city, from the Caspian Sea. And then, only to the mouth of the Moskva River. Then the circus with flat-bottomed barges began. In summer, the level in the Moskva River dropped to 30 centimeters. And how could we have grown a huge trading city? And he didn't just grow up in the 16th century. Already in the middle of the 18th century, the area of the amazing trading city grew to 70 square kilometers. This city has become the largest in the world, and this is despite the fact that the number of residents has not only not grown, it has decreased. In the 16th century, the population of Moscow was 200,000 people. Then the city grew almost 4 times in area. But the population of the grown city has decreased to 160,000 people. I wonder how this can be. Let's go back to London for comparison. In 1807th year, the population is 1 million people. The area of the city is 17 square kilometers. In 1843, the area of London grew to 50 square kilometers. The population has also grown to 2 million people. Just compare Moscow with 160,000 inhabitants, an area of 70 square kilometers. London has 2 million inhabitants. The area of the city is 54 square kilometers. Such a huge difference in numbers tells us one thing, that at the beginning of the 19th century in Moscow, they came up with a completely fake story. And the real history of Moscow began only after its conquest by Napoleon and Alexander I, who represented the interests of a certain foreign group. So, all the maps, paintings, and photographs of Moscow, released before the middle of the 19th century, are clearly fake. And interestingly, the people who painted the fictional Moscow again did not coordinate their paintings with the people responsible for the literary component of this project. Look here. Once upon a time, there lived a well-known artist in narrow circles, Fyodor Alexeyev. The person seems to be authoritative and very attentive to details. In 1800, Alexeyev, commissioned by Paul I, came to Moscow to paint views of the old Russian capital. The pictures turned out to be simply gorgeous. Take this one, for example, Red Square in Moscow. Photographs have not yet been invented, and we can only judge the appearance of Moscow at the beginning of the 19th century by studying the paintings of such artists. So at first glance, Alexeyev's paintings are very reliable. But sadly, counterfeiters are punctured on trifles. The artist Alexeyev also got caught on the little things. And do you know why? He just didn't like to read. Here's a look at what literary agents have done when describing Moscow, namely the Kremlin Towers. In 1771 year, in connection with the plans for the construction of the Kremlin Palace, the Tainitskaya Tower was dismantled. In 1783 year, it was restored without a diverting Strelnitsa. In 1862 year, Strelnitsa was restored in forms stylized as the 17th century. The diverting Strelnitsa is this part. That is, the Strelnitsa was completed only in 1862 year, and in the picture of Fyodor Alexeyev, this Strelnitsa is already standing. It seems to be nothing unusual, just an artist in 1801 year painted a Strelnitsa, built only in 1862 year. Probably, Fyodor Alexeyev was able to foresee the future. Another famous painter, Gust Kadal, was also able to predict the future. He painted his masterpieces in 1819. His painting is simply beautiful, especially panoramic views of Moscow. Specially trained people like to praise Kadal and say, August Kadal's panorama is an exceptional visual document in terms of its historical value, on which the entire post-fire Moscow is presented in full view. At first glance, Kadal's paintings are very reliable. But this artist also inattentively read literary technical assignments, and by mistake painted the Petrovskaya and the second unnamed towers on the southern wall of the Kremlin, which had not yet been restored by his arrival. Kadal painted in 1823 year, and the towers were restored only in 1836 year. Kadal also painted the archer of the Tainitsky Tower, which will be built only in 1862 year. Here is another image made according to Kadal's drawing. Published in 1830s. We see the Strelnitsa again, which will be built only in 30 years. And this is the Sheremetyevo Strange Foster home. In front of him, we see a round water collecting fountain. This is also a picture of the brilliant Kadal. So, Kadal left Moscow in 1823 year. The fountain was installed only in 1831. So the brilliant Kadal painted the fountain 8 years earlier than it was installed. So, we don't have any real images of Moscow published earlier than the mid-19th century. But the most interesting thing awaits us in the photos section. And here's another very interesting point. History is a very interesting organism. He never stays alone, he is constantly changing. Here's a look at what interesting changes have occurred recently. Open Wikipedia and look at the history of the Kremlin Towers. In 1862 year, according to the Kompioni project, the Tainitskaya Tower was repaired. Do you see the link above? Click on it. And this is what is written in the popular scientific literature of the Soviet era. It is often mistakenly stated that the branch Strelnitsa was not repaired but built this year. You see how the historians have been fussing. Like in the Soviet Union, scientists were wrong when they said that the archer of the Tainitsky Tower was built only in 1862 year. So, the new documents clearly state that the Strelnitsa was not built, but restored. Historians of the new Russia probably know more than historians of the Soviet Union. But these are all small things. Let's look at the photos. There was a fabulous photographer, Roger Fenton, in the 19th century. He is a very talented person, and most importantly, he succeeds everywhere. In 1855 year, Roger Fenton, an employee of the English Photographic Company and secretary of the First London Photographic Society, appeared in the Crimea and took 800 photographs. But these photos are not interesting today. After all, Fenton had visited Moscow before. Here they are, wonderful views of 1852 year. We see flat-bottomed barges, and a little further, on the archer of the Tainitsky Tower. But after all, the Strelnitsa will be built only in 1862 year. How so? There is a photograph of 1852 year. In this photo, there is a Strelnitsa, which has not yet been built. So, these photos were taken no earlier than 1862 year. But these are all small things. The similar history of Moscow is even more interesting, and the walls of the Kremlin were built only at the end of the 19th century. I have an old video about this. So, Fenton's photographs confirm that 3 years ago, I was absolutely right when I assumed that the Kremlin walls were a new model of the late 19th century, built around the old bastion. Look at this unique photograph of Roger Fenton, allegedly taken in 1852nd year. Look at the slope of Borovitsky Hill. An old stone wall is visible. Look at this buried arch. It's like an old bastion. The roofs were protected from the rain from above. Here they are, the walls of the fortress, about which historians are silent. What kind of fortress? Watch my old video. At this place, at the end of the 19th century, more precisely in 1893rd year, a monument to Alexander II was erected. Look, there are still stones left from the walls of the bastion on the left. In general, a new monument was installed on the walls of an ancient fortress, which no one mentions at all. Although judging by this photo, it is simply impossible not to notice these walls, but you will not find any scientific work on this topic. And do you know why? Yes, because the walls of the Moscow Kremlin are a new model of the late 19th century, and no one will admit that for sure. And here's what's interesting. This photograph dates back to 1852nd year, but I think that's not the case. And this photo is in the 90s of the 19th century. Look here. Fenton took a photograph of the Great Stone Bridge in 1852nd year. The bridge was destroyed in 1858. It amazes me how it was possible to demolish such beauty. After all, there is almost the same in Prague. In Alexeyev's paintings, this bridge is in all its glory. But do you know what the most interesting thing about this bridge is? Look at it carefully, think about it. Okay, I'll tell you. You wouldn't guess anyway. This bridge never existed. Look here. This was taken by Fenton in 1852. It was made in 1855. And here is the most interesting photo of 1857. A large stone bridge before demolition. First, look at the illogicality of this bridge. It completely blocks the river. Look at the bare stones of the bridge gifts. It's not just the barge here. An ordinary boat will not pass here. In the distance, we again see the archer of the Tainitsky Tower, which will be built only in 5 years. Now we look at the photograph of 1908 from the collection of Gaultier de Fay. Look, a new stone bridge has already been built. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior is finished. In another photo from the same series, we see poles with wires. And this is very important. This confirms that this is the 20th century, that is, 1908th year. Now we look at the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. It was completely built and illuminated in 1883rd year. Well, strangely enough, in the photo of 1908, we see that the exterior decoration is not finished yet. Now the most interesting part. Look at these barges with houses. More precisely, on the windows of these barges. This is 1908th year. Now we go back to 1857th, and what do we see? And we see exactly the same barges. With exactly the same windows. Only they stand at the painted stone bridge. In other words, 50 years have passed, and the barges have been standing in their places. The same barges, the same windows. Just added a normal bridge with large spans. Even this awning barge has not disappeared anywhere. It just shifted a little. But there is a difference of 50 years between these photos. So in fact, we do not know at all what Moscow really looked like in the middle of the 19th century. We do not know exactly when the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was built. Judging by the photo of 1908th year, it was just built, and even the exterior decoration has not yet been completed, but it should have been completely finished back in 1883 year. It seems that the whole history of Moscow was written already at the end of the 19th century. They came up with unique Kremlin walls, a large stone bridge, completely unsuited for navigation. It was only at the beginning of the 20th century that the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was built, probably the only one in the world. They drew a 1,000-year history of orthodoxy. And all this so that the defeated people would never have guessed that they have been under occupation for the last 300 years. And for 300 years in a row, the most affordable job is to be a boatman, to carry looted resources to Europe. And at the same time, no one should grumble, because the main feature of Russians is spirituality and tolerance. There may be a sequel. That's it. Watch my channel.